Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, their.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the Magi and Zoroastrianism.
Woohoo! Check out the episode description for links to any references we make in this episode.
So, our season is all about Epiphany, and what is Epiphany about if not the Magi? And so we thought we would talk about them and Zoroastrianism, which is the faith that they are traditionally associated with. So let's start by talking about who the Magi are in the Bible and how they're talked about. The passage that we usually talk about when it comes to them is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 18.
Technically, we just usually talk about Matthew 2, 1 through 12, but I think it's important to find out what happens when they leave and what Herod decides to do when he finds that they have not returned to report back.
Yeah, that's a whole separate thing, yeah. But
it is, but that's
their existence sort of leads to horrible things, but it's not exactly their fault, but that's more complicated than what... Yeah, we're not getting into that part of the story today.
We've got a whole episode on it with Reverend Colette Brody-Grund, so we'll just link to that.
So let's talk about some of the myths that are popular about the Magi in the Bible. One is that all of the Magi are men. We don't actually know that because of how the Greek language in ancient Israel used gender. We're certain that at least one of the Magi was a man, because the rule was if there is one person in a crowd that is a man, then that crowd uses masculine pronouns and so forth. Whereas if they are all not men, then you'd use feminine pronouns.
Yes. So it could have been one man and 100 women.
Yeah.
Or one man and a bunch of non-binary folks, for all we know. Yeah. Continuing our Magi Mythbusters edition, we also don't know how many there were. We just know that there were more than one, because it's plural, and we know that there were 3 types of gifts brought. We don't know that each Magi brought one gift, or that no Magi brought the same gift. Like, we know it's taboo at, like, baby showers, to bring the same thing as somebody else unless it's diapers. But I don't think it was that taboo back then. So we just know there are 3 gifts and some number of Magi.
For what it's worth, also, the baby showers I've attended, if you happen to bring extra chocolate for mom, nobody minds. More people can bring extra snacks. That's fine.
It's more if you buy the exact same book or something.
Yes, that's a little awkward.
Yeah. I always buy the books, so everything else is just a little bit audio.
I have established a tradition for myself in the extended family of I am the person who shows up with a gift card and a piece of nice chocolate for the person that we are celebrating, and they really seem to appreciate that.
I think that's brilliant. I like that. It's the gift that shows you know them in some capacity, and here's money to spend the way that you need to.
You just had a baby. You just bought a house. You just got married. You need money.
Yep. I like it. We also don't know where the Magi came from. We know that they came from somewhere east of Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and we know that it probably took a while to travel. We'll get into a little bit more about this if we're following the tradition that the Magi were likely Zoroastrians. Then that gives us some more hints as to where they might have been coming from, but we know that it took a while to travel there. Which brings us to our next myth. The Magi were not actually present at the birth of Jesus, unlike the lobsters. I couldn't help it. I just love there was more than one lobster present at the birth of Jesus.
Thank you, Emma Thompson. In Love Actually, for those who don't recognize the reference.
It's true. Emma Thompson, what a gem.
Absolutely.
And in that movie, she was excellent. Not my favorite movie, but one of my favorite actresses. Anyway, so they were not present at the birth of Jesus. The scripture that we have and tradition says that at the birth of Jesus, they saw a star. And then they had to get their stuff together and travel following the star and then go to Herod. And then, so it took them a while to get to Jesus. So it's more likely that Jesus was toddlerish than that he was a newborn.
Yeah.
And then finally, as we hinted at, Magi is a gender-neutral term. It is not automatically masculine. It's not automatically feminine. It is a gender-neutral term. So it could mean any number of genders, really.
Sure.
It's more about the person and what they're doing than about their gender.
So we are mostly going to use the word magi for this group of people, but they have been called a number of different things, including the wise ones, the wise men, the three kings, or a lovely alternative, the seekers of wisdom, as they are called in the First Nations version of the Christian New Testament.
Which, if you have not checked that out, you definitely should. It's fantastic. I actually used it when I was reading the Gospel for Epiphany this year.
Yeah, and of course we know that they followed a star, which is why we get to talk about astronomy and related things a whole lot this season, which is honestly part of why we're doing Epiphany this season. I think it helps. So.
It's true. We love space. We really do. If you have not heard of Jan Richardson, she is an artist and a priest and a poet.
A gifted poet, yeah.
Yeah, amazing things. And we'll link to this, but she wrote a lovely poem called Wise Women Also Came. And I think it does a great job of expanding our understanding of the story, because so much patriarchy has narrowed it into 3 rich, wealthy king men came with these things. And so it helps kind of shift the way that we think about this story that is well known and not well known to many of us. So definitely check out that poem and art that she did. Also, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the pop culture part, but the Magi brought gifts. This we know. And the gifts had different meanings. If you want kind of the more comprehensive explanation of the meanings of the gifts, you should definitely check out our Epiphany episode with Jessica Davis, where she explains a lot more about all of Epiphany, and in particular, they explain more about what each of the gifts have historically been used for and what they could mean at the time. But the basics are bringing gold was something to bring for a king, so recognizing the royalty of Jesus. Frankincense is an incense, and so it is something for a deity, right? We burn incense, let our prayers rise as incense before God. And then myrrh was actually used in burial, and so it symbolizes death or mortality. And so the combination of those 3 gifts is really perfect for who we understand Jesus to be as God incarnate and God with us, and also human, divine, all the things.
Sure. So what about the Magi in church-related things since the Bible? Well, obviously, if you have a nativity, the Magi do not show up at the nativity until Epiphany. Now, after Christmas, you can have them wandering in search of the nativity all over the place. I've done this occasionally with churches. It is good fun. And also, if you have a nice nativity set that's larger for your church, it can be fun to post pictures of the Magi wandering the church in search of baby Jesus over the course of the days after Christmas.
The first Christmas season of the pandemic, I took pictures the whole of Advent through, I think, Baptism of Jesus, of my different nativity pieces, wandering around and getting ready, and Mary's cravings, but also a whole bunch of different Magi following the star. And I will try and see if I can link to that, because I think I made a Facebook photo album of my adventures.
Yes.
Pun.
And many of us may know the traditional 3 Magi as Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, because that has traditionally been their names in Western churches. And of course, either Balthazar is black or all of them are black. They certainly should all be people of color. And in the Eastern Church, they actually have a whole bunch of different names for the Magi, and it's not just 3, and they vary, I think, depending on where you are. And then there is a tradition in some parts of Christianity to bless your home at Epiphany. And often when you do this, it involves writing the letters CMB and also the year on the doorframe of your home in chalk. And CMB actually stands for a Latin house blessing phrase that you would use to bless your house with. But it has also been noted that it contains the initials of the Magi, which is appropriate because this is happening at Epiphany. So that's interesting too.
Yeah. Also, sometimes Casper is Jasper, spelled with a G. So if you see that, it's just a different way of things. Also, especially in a lot of Latin American cultures, Three Kings Day is a really big deal. Whether it's like kids putting some straw in their shoes the night before and then finding candy and the camels have eaten the straw, or like there are parades and marches and like all sorts of things to celebrate the approach and the appearance of the Tres Reyes, the three kings, the Magi. And that is in my like particular liturgical properness. That is the like main way that I'm like, yeah, okay, go for it. I think that's great. Technically, Baptism of Jesus is a bigger holiday than Epiphany or Christmas, but we don't really celebrate it that way in the church. But I do think it's interesting. Yeah.
Sure.
But Tres Reyes is traditionally a way that a lot of Latin American cultures have celebrated this particular season, and it's fun to see kids riding on like donkeys and camels and all sorts of things for this celebration.
Yeah.
And that brings us to Magi in pop culture. So, as we mentioned, our Epiphany episode has a lot of this, especially Jessica talked about Amal and the Night Visitors, which is a classic opera involving the Magi and a little boy named Amal. So, if you are into opera or open to opera, that would be a great one to check out. Also,
I hear it's a great opera specifically for people who aren't into opera because it's not very like difficult to understand. It's very
nice,
relatable. So
nice. That's awesome. Also, American Born Chinese, which is originally a graphic novel, but also the first season is out on Disney Plus right now, though I think they canceled it because capitalism and evilness. But in American Born Chinese, spoilers, the Monkey King ends up having a part in the Nativity, particularly as a Magi. And it's really cute and was unexpected to me, even though I knew there was a Nativity somewhere in the graphic novel because of how I received the book. But it's a great graphic novel. It's well worth the read and a quick read.
Yeah. The Magi do make a brief appearance at the start of the 1959 movie Ben-Hur. And speaking of the Magi showing up in search of Jesus, as they do in that movie, they also show up in Monty Python's movie Life of Brian. And they show up at Brian's family's house first with their gifts until they find out that they are in the wrong home, and in fact they are supposed to be across the street. And so instead they are pointed in the right direction and take their gifts back and go next door to Jesus.
That's fantastic. I love it. Also, there are, and we kind of hinted at this, right, with Jan Richardson's poem, but there are a lot of common jokes and memes and all sorts of things about what the three wise women would have brought, including casseroles and food and clean clothes for everybody. Also, there must have been, it can't have been all men because they stopped and asked for directions. And the three wise men were 2,000 years ago. All we have now are wise guys. So many different really nerdy jokes and puns, or jokes and memes. If you have any favorites, please let us know. We would love to delight in them.
And sprinkle them through the rest of our season on Epiphany. Absolutely.
Exactly.
With attribution, of course.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there is the classic short story, The Gifts of the Magi by O. Henry, which I spoke about in our Epiphany episode as well. But among other things, it's about, let's say, the difficulty of gift giving.
I believe you. I have not seen that one.
It's a married couple. They buy lovely gifts for each other. Everything kind of goes wrong, but it's not because they don't care about each other.
Okay, that tracks. Yeah. So, that's the Magi.
Yeah.
And as Kay mentioned at the beginning, we are connecting the Magi and Zoroastrianism because, depending on translations and all sorts of things, Magi can actually mean Zoroastrian priest. Amazing.
Yeah.
And the Zoroastrianism, the religion, developed during the 2nd millennium BCE, and so as one of the oldest religions that continues today, it was really important to us to like there's actual legitimate credibility for, they could have been the Magi, or the Magi could have been Zoroastrian priests. And so we wanted to dig into what is Zoroastrianism. And that's part of like each season, we kind of want to see if we can explore a different religion or a faith practice in more depth, because that's part of being people of faith, is learning about other faiths.
And being good neighbors.
Yes. So, a brief history. As I mentioned, Zoroastrianism developed during the 2nd millennium BCE from Indo-Iranian ancient religions. So, that's Iran and northern India, and the nomadic herding tribes in those areas kind of shared some ancient religions, and from that came the Vedic religion, Hinduism, and also Zoroastrianism. And the kind of main regions for those were the Sistan and Helmand Basin regions, which we know that those were important to Zoroastrianism because the imagery in the texts focus heavily on and draw from those regions. And Zoroastrianism became the foremost religion of the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian empires in the first half of the 1st millennium BCE. This is tricky doing millenniums in the BCEs. And we are doing our best for pronunciation, but these are all things that we've learned by reading, and so we trust that you will give us grace as we try to give others grace with our pronunciation stuff.
Some of these words we have tried to look up how they're pronounced, and it turns out that Google is confused.
Yes, very much so. So, Zoroastrianism lost its dominance in that area during the Arab invasion and defeat of the Sasanian Empire, and Turkish and Mongol invasions in the 11th and 13th centuries drove it out of rural areas as well, from Iran and into the desert towns of Kerman and Yazd. And the exodus from Iran to India shortly after the Arab conquest was in 651 CE, and there in India, Zoroastrians are known as Parsis, and they actually were an influential minority during British occupation.
Yeah. So are there Zoroastrians in the Bible? Well, we've already talked about the Magi in Matthew chapter 2, but there's also another possibility, and the thing is that because of the general fuzziness of exactly when Zoroastrianism really conglomerated into a single religion and when the prophet Zoroaster lived, we're not entirely sure, but it is possible that in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, when King Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon and ends the Babylonian exile and frees the Jewish exiles to go back home, it's possible that Cyrus and Persia may have been Zoroastrian at that time. The timeline just isn't clear enough, and we can't really know.
Yeah, but it's a possibility. So,
yeah.
And so that brings us to what are the beliefs and practices of Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrians believe in a supreme god called Ahura Mazda, which would be translated as wise lord. And they believe that Ahura Mazda revealed the religion to the priest Zarathustra, or as Greeks called him, Zoroaster. And Zarathustra is considered the founder of the religion, and followers are Zartoshtis or Zoroastrian. The central kind of tenet of Zoroastrianism is that there is a dichotomy between good and evil, and Ahura Mazda created the world in order that the two forces could engage with one another, and the evil one will be incapacitated. Also, the final and definitive defeat of evil at the end of time and restoration of the world to its once perfect state is kind of the end goal.
Yeah. In Zoroastrianism, a person's afterlife is determined by the choices that they have made while on Earth. And they also very prominently feature the sacredness of earth, water, and most famously, fire. Hence, there is a eternal flame as a symbol of Ahura Mazda in every Zoroastrian temple. And one way that Zoroastrians have often been noticed, frankly, by their neighbors as Zoroastrians and have set themselves apart, is that instead of practicing cremation or burial of the dead, which they believe would desecrate the sacred elements of either fire or earth, they place dead bodies on raised platforms that are called towers of silence for the birds to eat. So this has been denigrated and ridiculed by various people over the years, but this is them attempting to maintain the sacredness of their sacred elements. And also, the Parsis population in India will not accept converts to the religion, but Iranian Zoroastrians and those who have immigrated from Iran will. But they are also very discreet about it in Iran in order to avoid angering the government, who would not want that to happen.
And for the most part, even when they do accept converts, it is not a religion of conversion the way that Christianity or Islam might be.
Yeah, they don't evangelize.
Yeah. So while there is a supreme god called Ahura Mazda, there's also lesser deities, and those we'll get into more about how they come into play, but I also want to name that it is a pluralistic religion. Even though Ahura Mazda is like the supreme god, there's also multiple deities.
Yeah.
And so the key sacred text is the Avesta, which was composed in Avestan, which is an ancient Iranian language. And the Avesta consists of multiple different texts recited in rituals by priests and sometimes lay people. And it originally came from an oral tradition that developed over time and then was eventually written down. So there's kind of two parts. The older Avesta was created in the mid to late 2nd millennium BCE, and that primarily centers around the rituals, and so just the priests will recite the older Avesta. It has 5 gathas, or songs of Zoroaster, and those that consists of 17 hymns and is central to the yasna of 72 chapters, as well as the yasna Haptan Gaiti, which is also central to the yasna of 72 chapters, which we can tell by the name. And something that I thought was really cool, because we just had our episode on cosmology, is at the end of yasna 43 and the beginning of yasna 44 is arguably the most poetic section of all of them. But it is a series of rhetorical questions posed to Ahura Mazda about the creation of the universe. And so that just sounded really cool. And I was like, oh, look, another cosmology. It's amazing how cosmologies come to play, which is fun. Mm-hmm. And then the older Avesta also has 2 more prayers. And part of what comes out and what we find in the sacred text are purity laws around how to be most proper. And the Videvdad or Vendidad address pollution specifically and are centered around like caring for the earth. And then also the 9-night purification ritual called Barashnum Nu Shab is for someone defiled by contact with a dead body. So they take particularly what happens if you are in contact with a dead body really seriously, both in how they take care of dead bodies and then also like if you have contacted them, which makes sense for a religion that has been around for so long and so much before we knew kind of what happens to bodies as they decompose and kind of that science and germ disease stuff.
Kept a lot of people safe, I'm sure.
Yeah. And then, as we mentioned, the rituals are recited and performed by priests who are expected to memorize them, and they take place inside the fire temple.
Yeah. And then there's also the younger Avesta, which is more recent and a greater volume. And it helps demonstrate the development of the religion over the years. It includes devotional texts for everyone to recite, and there are 21 hymns or yashts to various divinities over whom Ahura Mazda presides and demands their praise. And most of the younger Avesta was orally composed, and then from the late Sasanian period onwards, it was written down.
And so what Kay mentioned about the yashts to various divinities, each 30-day month is dedicated to a different deity and named for that deity in their calendar, and their yasht is recited in their month as the yasht for the day.
Yeah.
And they also invoke individual deities for tasks. For example, the Mithra watches over contracts, Anahita helps people conceive and give birth, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And then the small or Korda Avesta has some short prayers, blessings, and other texts.
Sure. So what about Zoroastrianism in the world today? Well, we think that there are about 100 to 200,000 Zoroastrians around the world, and most of those are going to be centered in Iran or India. Those in India are descended from those who had left Iran, which was then called Persia, due to Muslim persecution after around 700 CE. And that population in India, as we've already mentioned, has been called the Parsis. And there are probably less than 25,000 of those folks left in India by now. And the population there is, according to people who study population, fairly likely to die out by the end of the century due to their not accepting converts. There were about 15,000 Zoroastrians in the United States as of 2012, which is the most recent number I could find. And most of those were immigrants from Iran. And estimating the actual numbers of Zoroastrians in Iran is difficult due to the government cracking down on non-Muslim populations. So the Zoroastrians in Iran themselves say that there are 60,000 of them in that country, but other sources say somewhere between 10 to 30,000. It's difficult to be exact. Still, however, quite a noticeable population.
Yeah.
And also, in recent years, there has been a resurgence of Zoroastrianism among the Kurds as a way of reclaiming their ancient culture after generations of persecution in the Middle East, as many of their ancestors, if you reach all the way back, were Zoroastrian to start off with.
And then what about pop culture? Where does Zoroastrianism come up in pop culture? My, of course, favorite example is from the movie Bohemian Rhapsody, and Freddie Mercury of Queen, the band, and his family were Zoroastrians. And so I've talked about it before on the podcast, but the ways that Freddie's dad in particular reminds him of good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And then at the end of the movie, it kind of comes back. But that's part of Zoroastrianism in particular for that family.
Yeah. Although I have to say, I do suspect that any time that Freddie Mercury comes up as an example of pretty much anything, he's going to be one of your favorite examples of whatever that is.
I mean,
just a theory.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
He's pretty wonderful.
If you play computer games, the Zoroastrian faith shows up in Civilization 5 and Civilization 6, which is obviously the favored religion of the Persians. And it also appears in most of the Crusader Kings games, again, as the religion of the Persians. And it appears with more or less detail in each game. It depends. But it is noticed in each of those. And I am not a Game of Thrones person, and neither is Emily, but we do recognize that it is a major force on the universe, and especially nerddom. And so I did want to mention that the Game of Thrones series apparently has a faith that is somewhat parallel to Zoroastrianism, which is called, I assume I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the faith of R'hllor, the Lord of Light. And so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. That's also an interesting name because it reminds me of the Hebrew for light, which is Or, I believe. And one of the names of God, the first time any human names God, which is Hagar naming God, she names God Eldroy, the God who sees me. And so that it is not, I don't think, but it feels like a combination of those two words in one that works for the Lord of Light. So I don't know. That's kind of funny.
And I've heard rumors that, authors sometimes do research for their fiction, and so it's possible that George R.R. Martin knew that.
It's true. I think the best writers do some research, especially if it's not
I would hope so.
Their direct wheelhouse. Yeah. So, now for our Muppets moment. Okay, what gifts would the Magi Muppets bring?
Well, I don't know if I'm just on a kick for this or what, but we did very recently record our first episode of this season on cosmology, and I brought up Miss Piggy and Rolf for that one. And so the first Muppets I thought of for this question are also Miss Piggy and Rolf. And Miss Piggy would obviously... Oh, good. Miss Piggy would obviously bring a certificate for karate lessons. because that comes in handy for so many different reasons. And she'd want to make sure that the child is educated. And so I think that would be great. And Rolf, I tend to think, would probably bring a or possibly a few musical instruments. But as much as he does love the piano's not great for traveling. And these guys are going to have to, at first they think they're going back to Nazareth, and then they find out they're going to Egypt. And so probably it would be something a little more travel friendly, whether a kazoo or a harmonica or something else. So.
I mean, Bishop Brenda Boss would probably join them with the kazoo, hence
yes,
our
absolutely.
Muppets music. But when you started talking about that, I was like, wait, would Rolf actually be the little drummer boy? And now I'm picturing, the baby Muppets?
I think Rolf has enough empathy to not bring baby Jesus a drum because he, presumably does not want to get Mary and Joseph angry at him.
I mean, the Baby Muppets show?
Yes.
I'm imagining
Muppet Babies.
Muppet Babies, thank you. I'm imagining baby Rolf actually coming and playing music for baby Jesus.
Actually, the Muppet Babies did sometimes sing and play very simple instruments, and one of the very common instruments for them to have was a tambourine. I could see that. How about you, Emily? What gifts would your Magi Muppets bring?
So I also thought of Miss Piggy, but I was thinking more along the categories that the Magi were bringing stuff for, right?
Sure.
Something for royalty, something for divinity, and something for mortals. And I was thinking of Miss Piggy in particular for royalty, and that I think she would bring, and I'm thinking of the fancy outfits that she sometimes has, right? That she would bring a beautiful gown or robe for baby Jesus.
Sure. She does know from bling. Absolutely.
But then I was having more trouble with what do you bring divinity? What do you bring the divine?
I mean, there is a dessert called divinity, which I don't think I've ever had, but I hear it is pretty yummy.
Fantastic. So. I love it. It's a hit or miss. You either love it or you don't love it. I love divinity, and I haven't had any since I lived in Iowa because my best friend's mom's mom used to make it and send it, and so we'd get to eat it.
It is also, I think, a little tricky to make because it involves whipping eggs into meringue or something, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a meringue kind of thing. I love it. I absolutely love divinity and wish that I could make it / had access to it. So that would be an interesting one, and that we could have the Swedish chef make divinity. I think that would be delightful, and I think that Fozzie Bear would work with him on that because of the pun.
Yes, absolutely. I'm trying to imagine the Swedish chef stirring up eggs into meringue, and you might wind up with one piece of divinity by the end, but the rest of the eggs are going to be all over the walls and ceiling. Yeah.
That's highly likely, highly likely. Also, I was thinking about mortality, and I was all I could think of was Oscar the Grouch, and I think that, his visit would be the reminder that we all die and decompose in the end.
And become trash. So my husband's birthday will occasionally fall on Ash Wednesday, and apparently having a nice supper and then some birthday cake and then going to church and having your spouse put a cross of ash on your forehead is a deeply weird experience and reminder of one's mortality. He likes to remind me of this every so often. So I could see how Oscar the Grouch could be an interesting choice for that. Thanks for joining us. Theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Lachlan, and our Muppets music was by Brenda Boss, and our seasonal artwork was by Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into astrology with our special guest, Emily Ann Garcia. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it's cheaper than gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Really individually either, yeah.
Yeah, any or all. Also, don't forget that you can find all of these episodes with captions on YouTube at bit.ly/NAC Season 4 with the number 4.
Cool. Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter, what would the Magi Muppets bring, do you think, to baby Jesus?
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
Pax
vobiscum.
vobiscum.